Max El-Haj here. On this episode of the Corpus Animus podcast, we talk about running in the sport of CrossFit with training think tank coaches Ryan and Kyle Ruth. If you're on the go and you want to listen to just the audio version, subscribe to the Corpus Animus podcast on your favorite podcast app. Get better at the sport of CrossFit alongside some of the best athletes in the world in our online training program, The Design. Head over to our website, trainingthinktank.com/DSGN to learn more.
All right, today's topic, we're going to be talking about running in the sport of CrossFit. We brought Ryan in to talk about it a little bit because he's got just kind of recently dug into running. And so we're going to throw to you, Ryan, since you're the new one on the podcast. Give us a little background. Why did you start running? And how'd you get into it?
Yeah, so I competed in CrossFit under Max from 2013 through 15. Kind of stepped away from that to more focus on coaching. Moved on site here, and the environment was awesome for training, so I was like, I want to get back into that. A couple of back injuries left me with literally running as my singular option of training that was pain-free.
I would be doing no training.
Max would be laying in bed.
Yeah, my training is eating.
Yeah, well, I decided to pursue that.
His training was either eating or running, so that was the reality.
Or he did both,
And one of my buddies from college was like, hey, let's run this 10K. It's in Atlanta. I was like, no excuse. Ran that and was like, all right, well, let's see what happens for a half. Did that, and now I'm like, let's see what happens for a full.
You got bit by the running bug, man.
Yeah.
Yeah. Have you ever been bit by the running bug?
I ran a little bit in high school and middle school. Like I ran cross country, I ran track. I was awful at cross country and it was frustrating and, just like couldn't figure out why. Turns out I was a sprinter and I was just for some reason trying to do cross country. But outside of that, like I like to maintain good running metrics for CrossFit. And I can always tell that like I don't feel good in metcons if my running is deteriorating. So I run enough to make sure that my metcons feel good, but no more than that.
Yeah, I feel like there is some sort of a carryover, and it's different for different people. Like the run mileage you can maintain in a current week and still be able to do all the CrossFit stuff. There's a different threshold for different people based on like how much running have they done in the past, how springy are they, what's their actual body weight, what's their efficiency when they run. I think that stuff all plays a role.
One of the biggest things that I've found that happens is when I run a lot, the way that it impacts my CrossFit is that my ankles just get tight and like my squat positions turn to shit and like pistols start to get really hard. That's one of the biggest challenges I've run up against with running.
Your body is way different now running than when you were CrossFitting. Just like muscle mass distribution, body weight, all that stuff. Have you put any specific time into technical training for running now, and how does your body feel different running?
I haven't put any specific time into technical running. When I started doing some basic assessment stuff, I had Brandon look at me. He said it was like solid.
Yeah. Foot strike, position.
I mean, I'm always going to be a toe strike athlete because I walk basically
on my toes. Tiptoe walking.
Natural born runner.
And then I naturally run at 180 strides per minute, which is like your golden standard for your endurance athlete. So when I saw those things, I was like, I'm not really going to put too much time into it. And as I'm saying this, I'm like, I should put some time into that.
How much has your body weight changed since you got into running versus when you were at your peak as a CrossFit athlete?
I would say my peak CrossFit weight, I was like 195, and I'm like 178 right now.
Whew.
It's a pretty big difference, almost 20 pounds.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the number one things we know about running is that it's incredibly body weight dependent. Like if you look at, there's some of that research, and I think you're the one that pointed this out to me a while back, the amount of power output that's required to run like a 19-minute 5K, or maybe it was an 18-minute.
Yeah, I forget the exact numbers, but
someone at 200 pounds running like we'll just say an 18-minute, and again, I'm recalling stuff from like 5 years ago, but 200 pounds running an 18-minute is the equivalent of someone weighing like 150 pounds running a 15-minute 5K.
That's what, it was the world record holder. The world 5K record compared to a Clydesdale at 18 minutes, I think was the same. I mean, I don't know how they measure that or what formula they use, but that's just the power output that's required to move that much more mass.
Well, in CrossFit, for most athletes in the sport, they don't have the option to lose 15 pounds in order to improve their running metrics.
Yeah, I mean, I was doing a strength session yesterday, and for the first time in my life, I felt my thoracic spine. I was like, oh, no, this isn't right.
So I think one of the biggest challenges we run up into as coaches in CrossFit is just getting people to maintain their CrossFit capacity, their strength metrics and all those things while bringing their running capacity up.
Yeah. Well, going on that line of thought, but just kind of what we're talking about, he kind of has perfect running mechanics for somebody. And one of the things, I've obviously never been a good distance runner.
You should say that you did quotes.
Oh, I did air quotes. I do air quotes a lot.
Quote
on
unquote.
Normal words.
He's got quote unquote.
I do air quotes on the.
Yes, quote, perfect.
Quote. So when I was trying to get better at distance running for CrossFit, a lot of the feedback that I got was work on the technical aspect of running, work on your foot strike, pose running, and none of that stuff actually translated into my actual running mechanics changing and didn't improve my actual output. And I don't think that for me, those types of cues and trying to match those positions helped me maintain technique, but using a beats per minute cadence, like using a metronome and trying to actually match my foot strike to a timer actually helped me maintain those positions better. So I think there's just different ways that I think people need to approach getting better at the skill of running. And if you can do that, you might be able to do it on less volume so that you can do the other CrossFit stuff without it being so detrimental.
Well, along those lines, Ryan, working with CrossFitters, do you prescribe a lot of like running technical work, pose drills and things like that? Or do you just have people start running and give them maybe like one cue to focus on? How do you approach that?
Typically, it's hard to make any technical corrections from afar.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Generally, I'm not going to spend too much time on it. I can prescribe a few body line drills, but for me, the biggest thing that I'm going to prescribe is metronome running. I find that most people sit at like 150 to 160 strides per minute, which is like plodding and a lot of vertical oscillation.
And then if it's in a metcon, it's probably closer to 120. You get into the CrossFit shuffle, right?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, well, that is something. So I did like my series Weightlifting in the Sport of CrossFit, talking about some of the detrimental aspects of thinking of running or thinking of weightlifting in CrossFit, like weightlifting the sport. I think that same thing happens in CrossFit with running. You have running coaches getting in, commenting on running form, and I'm like, well, let's just say like, all right, you have all this muscle mass distributed and built from doing burpees, ring dips, shoulder to overhead, snatching, all this stuff that requires so much more muscle mass on your thoracic cage. Now that's going to limit the natural arm swing, your natural cadence, your spinal posture, your respiratory posture, and then you're getting cues from running coaches who are primarily only doing running with no upper body muscle mass. Is it possible that the optimal technique to run in a CrossFit body is actually different than a running body?
Yeah, like a running coach would look at Noah's run and they'd be like, well, he's got way too much twist in his torso, like he's throwing his arms side to side, like there's all these issues with his run mechanics. But at the same time, like that's the running technique and running mechanics that he's arrived at to be successful running in the sport of CrossFit versus running on like a pure running event at the CrossFit Games.
Do you think that you need some variability based on like if you're in a hinge-based
Absolutely.
metcon or a squat-based metcon, or
Yeah.
like if you're upside down and doing this? Like
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's kind of where I was thinking too, because like if you watch people, successful high-level CrossFitters on a rower, they're going to adapt their row mechanics based upon the other movements that are combined with the row, right? So if it's like wall ball and rowing, they're probably not going to go into like a deep knee flexion position at the front of the rower. I think the same is probably true for high-level CrossFitters with a lot of experience running in the sport of CrossFit.
Yeah, I've been working on myself on matching my respiratory cadence to my foot strike cadence, which is something that running coaches commonly talk about.
Yeah.
So like two inhales, two exhales on every step, something like that, just something to keep me focused. And I was thinking like, okay, well, if I'm just running, that's probably not that big of a deal because energy production and being able to breathe and be in this posture indefinitely while I'm running is the goal. But if I just finished doing handstand push-ups where I'm inverted and then I do heavy squat cleans, would going right into that respiratory cadence be bad for me because I might need to like re-regulate blood pressure, and there actually might be different limiters when you're running after or within a metcon as when you're just running on its own?
I think there's definitely something to that. I literally just got done doing some Murph prep stuff 2 days ago. And on the very final round of the Murph prep thing that I was doing, I went out to run the last 800 meters. and almost got into like a sense of panic breathing.
Yeah.
And I know enough about physiology to know that like that sense of panic is really tightly linked to CO2. And so I just upped my breathing cadence much higher than I would if I were just going out and running.
At that same pace.
Yeah, at the same pace. And as soon as I got some CO2 out, things started to calm down, the panic started to go away, and I could just kind of settle into a pace. But there's definitely something to that.
Yeah, so you're running for running, right? Like
Correct.
you're doing a marathon. So like, I don't know, you're training in depth enough, but do you do any mixed stuff? Like do you do burpees and running right now, or?
The most mixed we do right now is some weight vest running.
Yeah.
Shed the vest and then run at like the goal marathon pace.
Wow.
Any different? Is it any different at all?
It feels exactly like the final 3 miles of a half marathon. Like where you're just like, I think it's the constriction of breathing, and then like you can't rotate at all with the vest on. So I think that the combination of those things just creates the CO2 buildup that you're a little bit in a panic state, and then the weight makes your legs feel heavy.
Yeah.
So it's all, you capture like tissue tolerance, and you even capture maybe some like respiratory resistance training because of the vest.
Right.
Actually creating pressure down on the torso.
Watching him go through his run progression has made me realize how, so like in CrossFit, you can kind of go through these aggressive jumps in volume and intensity if there's, anything and everything in the training. You can go from doing 5 sessions a week to 8 sessions a week because you're not really like overloading any individual thing. But I've noticed from running, if you start adding a lot of run volume into people's program without any base building and like slow conditioning, even just like loaded walking to get their legs and Achilles tendons used to that much pounding, they will break down and it will impact a lot of things. And your progression has been pretty insane. Like I remember watching you do some of your easier beginning stuff and I'm like, oh, he's not doing that much, to where you are now has been pretty profound. Give me an idea, or give the audience an idea of like where you started and then what you're at now and what that time frame is like, to give some sort of context for if you are trying to build run volume, where do you start and how incrementally do you build that volume to get better?
Yeah, so the initial like build into running started in March, when that was like exclusively running, and March being 14 months ago now.
Yeah, a year and a plus.
A long run at that time was like 4 miles, and mentally that was honestly pretty hard to cope with.
Well, for a CrossFitter, a 4-mile run is a long run.
Yeah,
for
sure.
sure.
Me, that's a
you
long
were coming
run.
out of, well, you're a CrossFitter, Max. So.
Yeah.
You're coming out of a CrossFit background, a 4-mile run is a long run.
Yeah. We did a lot of linear, like 5 minutes here, 5 minutes the next week. So very slow build up. I didn't run more than 3 times in a week until after my most recent half marathon, which was in February of this year.
Yeah, so almost 10 months of progressing, or 11
Yeah.
months of progressing until you actually were running more than 3 times a week.
Were you
Right.
mixing things like sled drags and long weighted vest hikes and stuff like that to build tissue tolerance, or is it just those 3 run sessions and then maybe some accessory work in the gym?
We were doing all sorts of mixed work, or mixed work being like non-impact cyclical, some tissue tolerance, a lot of hikes. Started off unloaded, progressed to loaded. I've got the little dog pulling me around, so that's some resistance, I guess.
Is that resistance or assistance?
Yes.
Assistance, resistance.
Depends
Lateral
on which way he's
resistance.
going. But even still, like this morning, I came in here and did 3 hours of non-impact.
Cyclical work.
Cyclical
straight.
work.
Just 3 hours straight of,
Yep.
of non-impact
Yeah,
cyclical.
this is a
That's-
mistake. Go ahead, sorry.
I just think that's a perspective dose for a lot of CrossFitters. When people talk about like, oh, I want to do long, slow distance, and you prescribe 30 minutes of cyclical work for them, and they're like, this is so boring, this is so terrible. It's like, put it in perspective. Like endurance athletes, for real endurance athletes, long, slow distance sessions somewhere between like 2 hours and 6 hours.
Hours
Of work.
6 minutes can feel long in a workout to me. 6 hours.
Yeah.
But that gives an idea. Like I know a lot of people will want to get better at running, and then they'll just throw in, like they'll find a Nike run program and do a 5-day-a-week run program and then end up beat up. It gives some sort of a perspective that if you're actually trying to build run capacity, especially if you're starting in a heavily muscled big body, right? Like people that start running when they're young, it's like doing gymnastics when you're young or anything when you're young. You're getting progressive overload as you're going through your growth phase.
As you're gaining weight, you're getting progressive overload.
So
in
you're
and of
just
itself.
getting it
Yeah.
by the nature of biology. analogy, but when you're big, it's like, well, now you're starting by putting 230 pounds of impact on every step. Now you have to try to learn how to build the strength and the tissue resilience to do that. I don't think it's a good idea to go into high volume run phases just to get better at running.
Well, not only that, would you even recommend doing 3 hours, not 3 hours of running, but 3 hours of cyclical work for most CrossFitters? I don't have even any of my high level guys working 3 hours straight, long, slow distance work.
Yeah, I mean, they should be able to build that through their warm-ups throughout the course of the week.
Right.
Yeah.
So like my training is, like if I'm running for the day, like I have a little bit of a warm-up or an extensive warm-up depending on how aggressive the session is, but I don't need to spend 30 minutes of joint prep and stuff. It's like,
just
Get on,
and go.
get on the bike
Yeah.
and start spinning. Yeah.
That just made me think the marathon row at the games was 3 hours.
Yeah.
And we didn't really do anything in training outside of like an hour and 45 minutes, or maybe 2 hours. What's the distance or the duration that you need to train for if you might go to the games and train and do a competition that's like 3 to 4 hours?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that.
I
off
didn't
the top
change
of
my
head,
training models.
But at the same time, like looking at it, we did have people we did like a pseudo triathlon, if you remember, where it was like a bike run that was like an hour and 30 minutes going into that. So it wasn't quite the full duration of the event, but it was
Long
half
enough.
of it. It was
Yeah.
long.
Yeah.
I think most CrossFitters at that point, because those types of events are such outliers, that biasing your training to try and prepare for a 3 hour row is going to detract from the other things that are more likely to show up and potentially be a detriment to you in the long run.
All right, so we've been focusing on distance running, CrossFit as a sport. Let's talk about that devil of a machine over there in the corner. Both of them, the air runner and the true form, both of them are torture machines. You do some of your volume on there?
yeah, so one session a week right now.
Okay, and I do most of my training volume on it right now because I'm in the gym a lot.
I do none of mine because
You
I do
do
all
what,
my
trail?
runs. I do all my runs on my trail right behind my house. I have a mile trail behind my house, so I literally walk out on my fence and run them as much as I want.
What have you noticed from doing that?
It feels like a constant gradual uphill.
Like you're running uphill all the time?
Like it is a very challenging run.
Yeah.
I find that it's very hard to control my heart rate, and that I am not breathing crazy, but like
At the same effort level on the assault runner, would you say your heart rate is higher than it would be running on the road?
And paces, or is that related to paces too?
yeah, the paces are slower.
Way slower.
So let's say I'm like at a 10K type of effort pace. I'm probably 2 miles an hour slower on the air runner, maybe a mile and a half slower. So it's
Pretty substantial.
So at matched
Yeah.
RP or matched, rating of perceived exertion, you're slower on the air runner.
My heart rate is always high. Like
Okay.
when I run, like I'm gonna hold 185 to 190 beats for a half marathon. That's just
Really?
yeah.
Well,
Wow.
it's no different than
Yeah.
what you see from like Morad and
Yeah,
some of
yeah,
the
yeah.
CrossFitters
Yeah.
who are like,
Yeah.
well, now granted it's 15 minutes, not a half marathon.
Surprising to me just relative to the perspective I have of him as a CrossFit athlete.
Yeah.
Like not thinking of him as an endurance athlete at all. But I
But he's
guess
holding
he's changed.
90% of his max heart rate for an hour. And
Yeah.
how long does a half marathon take you?
My most recent one was 132.
So holding well over 90% of his max heart rate for an hour and a half.
Yeah. Air runner for me, it feels like a constant perpetual hamstring curl. Like it just feels like I am constantly having to pull my foot up. But I've used it, and the cue that I got, or the reason I used it, is because somebody told me that working on that would probably help me with my running faults because it would keep me more in line, as opposed to like, I think just football and wrestling, like my feet naturally land way outside of my midline and I almost like jump from side to side as I run. And when I accelerate, I think because in football, if you're a linebacker, you're always like moving downhill and always ready to move laterally. So a lot of my running volume in the past was not like straight line, good posture and run. So my actual footwork running was horrible. Whereas that actually really helped me. Like before it was right in front of where I'm sitting and I would basically be staring at that pole and I could just see like, is my head moving up and down, and I could stop the vertical oscillation. I actually find for CrossFit athletes, that might actually be a better training tool than going out on the road.
I will tell you that with all of my high-level athletes, we train almost exclusively during the majority of the season on an air runner or a true form, depending on what they have. And I have found that to have such good carryover to running on the road. And the reverse is not true. That if you have an athlete and you train them on the road and then hope that they do well on an assault runner or a true form event at a sanctional, that doesn't seem to help as much. Like there is something specific that happens training on the assault runner that has carryover to the road, but the road doesn't have carryover to the assault runner.
I find that same thing.
I think it's the elasticity use of your ankles. Like my ankles are pretty tight, so I just get to use the spring on the road, and that because there's a little bit of a give, and you do have to manually move it instead of going on a fixed object.
And you are landing on an incline,
Yeah.
right? Like you are technically landing on an uphill.
I've also found that I can give athletes not necessarily more volume in terms of mileage, but I can put them on the assault runner more frequently in the week than I could have them running on the road. I think, again, impact related. So if you have them running on the road, it's a hard surface, like you said, there's a lot of spring, there's a lot of tension in the Achilles, there's a lot of tension and just impact on the bones. So running on the assault runner or the true form reduces that impact. It's a soft surface, there's give to it, they're pulling it instead of impacting down onto it. And so people can tolerate a much higher frequency of running in their training if they're using an assault runner than if they're running on the road.
Yeah, I think the one thing you do have to be careful about is if you're going to send a CrossFit athlete to a Romus, where there's the aggressive hills, or you're going to send them to the games and there's, the old games where the berm was that's not going to replicate.
Not at all. Yeah, I agree with that.
Hill running is its own thing, and I feel like that might segue to be good. For running in CrossFit, you have to be able to run uphill or varied terrain, like Granite Games had basically a mountain that they were running on.
And Dubai, the sand dunes.
And then also loaded, which I think is another do you do it? Well, you said weighted vest running. I feel like weighted vests and sandbag carries and rucks.
50-pound rucks from this past year.
Which is an entirely different thing. So I didn't really do any weighted vest running back in the day when I was doing CrossFit. And then I took a big period of time where I just didn't run because my knees, ankles, back hurt. And then now I'm trying to prep for Murph, and I started running with a vest. And I actually find for me, I'm like, oh, this is easier than real running. Like relative to the field. I can't hold the same paces, but I think because I can notice that I stay closer to the ground. Like I don't actually lift my body up, whereas when I'm running, I can actually see the horizon change. Like I'm actually jumping from foot to foot. And I was like, this is really weird, but I can't breathe. It feels panicky.
That's the thing.
The compression on my thoracic
cage. There's something to be said when you're preparing athletes for those live events. There's something to be said for making sure that they're getting exposure to all the different types of running. But at the same time, loaded running is probably one of the hardest things on their knees that you could imagine.
Tolerate,
Yeah, so when you really start to ramp athletes up for sanctionals, you got to make sure that you're paying attention to patellar, just how their patellas are feeling, because that loaded run really does create some issues for the patella. And if you got to balance preparing the athlete and making sure that they're healthy enough to compete on game day. Those are
preparing them is being they're ready to compete.
Yeah. So when I say preparing, I mean
doing
giving them enough of the stuff
to
make sure that they can compete well. So I think that's another big consideration with loaded running specifically.
Yeah.
How would you prepare them for that then?
I think in the past, what I did is I just had them do loaded running all the time. You know what I mean? And once a week, if they were preparing for mayhem, right? So it was all right, let's make sure that we're preparing for some sort of loaded running. But after 3 or 4 weeks of loaded running, preparing for it, then they're like, man, my knees are so achy. Then you have to take 2 weeks off of loaded running until their knees feel good again, and you can start to re-progress it. So I think now I would put in more, this is within the last 6 months, I'd put in more just general knee health stuff. I think I'd spend more of the time, instead of doing weighted vest runs and ruck runs on the road, I'd spend more of the time doing it on the assault runner, especially with the athletes that have access to it, just because I think it would be generally more tolerable for them.
So the games last year had 4 tests, I think, with running before the final cut.
Yep. A sprint.
Yeah, one of them was a sprint. Then one of them was a loaded run. A long loaded run. One of them was repeat 400s. What was the fourth?
The repeat 400s was the
first workout.
Run, overhead squat, right?
Yeah.
That's all I've got off the top of my head.
Okay. Well, regardless, so when I created training progressions leading in, we did a sprint day. So I basically had a model where I was running 3 days a week, thinking like, well, I can't just have them run all the time. Like, I know they need to be good at running, but they have to be doing all the other training stuff. So I had one sprint and field day that included like dragging stuff, carrying stuff, sprint, change of direction, which actually ended up being really good. I know a lot of people are like, you know, we're not, sprinting, it might just be one workout, but this year the sprint actually ended up being a big separator and a big cut. 1 day a week of metcon style running of 400s in there, and then 1 day a week of like longer running, 5K style prep type running.
Well, you just touched on metcon running.
Yeah.
I think that's really important to point out here, that like running in a metcon is something that's just fundamentally different than running repeat 400s.
Yeah.
Like, you can get people better at running by doing 400 meter repeats on the track, but that won't necessarily transfer to getting better at running in a metcon, because it's something that's just fundamentally different.
That is true for all cyclical stuff, I've found. Like on the assault bike, there's people that crush the 10-minute assault bike time trial, and then in a 4 rounds for time of 20 cals and 20 burpees, Travis will hold a higher pace than they're holding by a lot. So I feel like it might be a good data metric. Sorry,
Do you feel like that is relative to the athlete though? Like, is Travis gonna take what he does on the assault bike only intervals and incorporate that into his metcons better than either of us, or is it?
Yeah, I don't know why. I mean, maybe that's why he's a good CrossFitter, but I was gonna say that might be a good, interesting data point at some point, is take like, what's your 5K running PR, and then do a metcon that has a mile with 400s, like say like, you know, 4 rounds for time of 40 wall balls and 400 meter run or something like that. And then what's the average 400 meter pace that you're able to hold relative to your 5K pace? And I bet you that'd be a more important variable for a CrossFit athlete than just the straight 5K.
I actually do that with a lot of my high-level athletes. I don't take it back and compare it to their 5K. What I do is I have them track their 400-meter metrics in metcon specifically.
Yeah.
So it's like, get your aggregate time. I care about what the overall time is. I care that you do, you know, the muscle-up component unbroken. But what really matters to me is getting those splits for each of the 400-meter runs within the metcon. And number one, keeping them relatively close together. But number two, just keeping track of them. Are they sub 130? Because if they're not sub 130, they're probably, as a male, they're probably not that competitive.
I mean,
there
might be even faster now.
I mean,
it depends on what the actual.
It needs to be sub 130 as like the baseline metric there.
But do you want to control anything else? So like, if we go ahead and we do our like a running test with, let's say, like deadlifts, Kyle's way stronger than me, right? So like, what a set of 15 deadlifts at 225 is going to do to him is very different than what it's going to do to me.
Yeah. How could you control those variables though?
I have no idea.
CrossFit makes it so hard.
But in the end, doesn't matter, because what we want is the overall performance to be better. Like I look at it more from the individual versus comparison sake. So like, is the individual sub 130? Okay, now where are you at relative to sub 130? Are you like running 125?
So you could give him 15 deadlifts at 185 and 225 or something like that.
And in the end, like, what I really want is him to be able to do those 225 deadlifts as fast as possible and run his 400 meters sub 130. So.
Yeah, I guess I was just thinking, like, people, if they know that that's what you're testing, will always have the ability to manipulate.
Oh, to take it easy on the deadlift.
Yeah, like, I'm going to do 3 sets of 5, which is only going to cost me 6 seconds.
Yeah.
Compared to someone going unbroken, but now I'm going to be able to hit that run a lot harder.
You can't tell them that you're collecting the data.
Well, it depends. I think that also depends on the level of the athlete, because with a high-level athlete, like, they're just going to go fast.
Yeah.
Right? They're going to be like, I'm going to try and hit these deadlifts unbroken, and I'm going to try and run sub 130 every 400 meter. Versus like what Ryan's bringing up, which is like, I'm going to sandbag the deadlift so that I can run as fast as possible on the 400 meter. I don't think that's an elite mindset.
So you're a runner now, in my head, not a CrossFitter. And
no, I would agree with that.
Is that a bad thing?
No, not at all.
Okay.
I was going to say, what psychological tips, as you've evolved into that, if you could go back to your previous self and improve your ability at running when you were still in a CrossFit headspace, what advice or guidance would you give to that person? Because I think a lot of the realization that I've had from doing running is I just had a shitty attitude about it. Like, I wanted to be better. I didn't want it to hurt. I needed to focus on breathing, respiration, mechanics. And I'm assuming your whole level of mental approach to the game has evolved at such a deeper level than mine.
Yeah, I mean, I've even seen that. I kind of made fun of you a little bit on Instagram about how I PR'd my 5K row with Mia, but it's just like the willingness to put up with the distress of breathing heavy, having my heart rate be really high. Ultimately, it's just a choice. Like,
would you say effort is a choice?
One could say that, yes.
It could be.
But yeah, I mean, like, yes, you're blowing up. Like, but all of that's like an internal focus, and the reality is like this is an external sport.
Yeah.
Your performance matters. You have to put up the best time you can. So like what you're sensing in the midst of a 5K row or in the midst of a 400-meter run with your overhead squats is really irrelevant.
Yeah, I like to think of it like this. It's like the high respiration rate and the really high heart rate and the overheating feeling. That's just the symptom of running fast. Like those are just the symptoms that you get when you run fast.
And you got to put up with the symptoms.
And at some point, you just have to learn to deal with the symptoms of your disease, which is running fast.
Is a sickness. Yes. That should be the title of
running
this.
Fast is a sickness.
Yeah. All right, so let's wrap it up with what practical takeaways for coach or an athlete trying to improve running in CrossFit. You only get one. Each one of us gets one.
Okay.
I'll go last.
Okay, I'll go. Keep track of run metrics within metcons.
Okay.
I think what you hit on earlier is like start slow and progress yourself at a comfortable rate. It's okay that you don't feel like you rammed your head into a wall every single day that you do running training.
Yeah, so would that be like, I was gonna say back off the competitiveness and build the volume, but that would be what you said. So I would say make sure that your running is as varied as possible. Make sure you include weighted vests, air runner volume in metcons, longer slow distance, 400s, 200s, sprint work. I think just that is part of the philosophy of being a good CrossFitter, but also from a sport perspective, I feel like it sets you up for if you go to a test that's in person, no matter what they throw out at you, you at least have some training exposure to all of that type of stuff.
I'd agree with that. And then I would say to piggyback on top of that, so I get a second one?
All right, you got the final word, so you better just slam it home right now.
No, I think the other one is make sure if you're a competitor in the sport of CrossFit that you bias your run training towards what the most likely thing to show up is. So if it's 400 meters on that assault runner, make sure that you're biasing your training towards 400 meters in a metcon on the assault runner.
I feel like I want to say something else. But
go for it, Max.
I'm just going to say if you need to do that, you need to do some research. Go to the competitions that you're actually going to and see what they've done in the past so that you know what to train.
Subscribe to the classroom.
Or the classroom, yeah.
Know your sport.